My name is Lena Hartwell, and I was 32 the birthday my whole family let my celebration go cold. I had set 12 places, pressed linen, hand-lettered name cards, my grandmother's good china that I'd inherited when she passed, the only thing she'd ever left me. My parents never came. My sister texted an excuse. My brother posted a photo of the party they were hosting instead. And one by one the chairs stayed empty while the candles burned down to stubs. So I sat at the head of a table built for a family and ate alone, crying into cake nobody else would taste. Then my grandfather walked in out of the rain and pressed an old leather ledger into my hands. I thought being left at that table was the cruelest thing they could do to me. I was wrong. By the time the rain stopped, 3 of them would wish I had never opened it. I had been up since 5 that morning because that is what I do when I am frightened. I cook. I arrange. I make things so perfect that no one can find a reason to leave. I am a financial investigator in Portland, and my entire career is built on following the trail of money that people thought they'd hidden. I know better than most how a number can lie, and how it can tell the truth louder than any voice in the room. This was the first year I had a house big enough, and a salary steady enough to host them all. I wanted it to be perfect. I told myself it was generosity. It was closer to a plea. For 30 years I had tried to earn a seat at the Hartwell table by being useful, by being excellent, by being the one who never asked for anything, and always brought the dessert. A perfect birthday was just the grown-up version of a child's report card slid across the kitchen counter, hoping somebody would look up. I brined the roast on Tuesday. I ironed the napkins on Wednesday. I wrote each name in my best hand, even the ones I wasn't sure would come, because hope is a stubborn accountant and it always rounds up. At 10 that morning, the house smelled like rosemary and butter, and a future I could almost believe in. At 10:15, my phone lit up on the counter, and the first message slid across the screen, like the first crack in ice you only hear after you've already stepped on it. It started small the way these things always do. Daniel first. Hey, something came up, can't make it, sorry. My brother 31, allergic to the word no and to commitment in equal measure. Then Claire, my sister 34, change of plans. We'll do something another time. No apology, just the clean snip of scissors. I told myself traffic. I told myself flu. I told myself anything but the obvious. Then my phone buzzed with a photo I wasn't meant to see, tagged by mistake in a group I'd been quietly left in. It was Claire's dining room, my parents at the table, Daniel pouring wine, my niece laughing. A roast golden and whole on a platter I recognized because I had given it to my mother 3 Christmases ago. They were all there. They had simply chosen a different table than mine. I called my mother Eleanor with my hand shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. She answered on the 4th ring over the sound of people I loved enjoying themselves. Lena, she said. It's a busy day. I asked her very calmly why no one had come. There was a pause, the kind where a person decides how honest to be. We only set 1 good table this year, she said. Then she hung up because there was gravy to pass. I stood in my kitchen with 12 place settings and 1 beating heart, and I finally understood the arithmetic. They hadn't forgotten me. Forgetting would have been mercy. They had looked at the invitation, looked at each other, and decided I wasn't worth the drive. The candles guttered. The food went cold in its serving dishes, and I did the only thing left to do. I sat down at the head of my beautiful empty table and I ate. You have to understand that I had been eating alone at that family's table my whole life, even when every chair was full. I came to the Hartwells when I was 2, that was all I was ever told. Adopted, taken in, given a roof when I might not have had one. It was the kind of story a family repeats until it hardens into a wall. My birthdays were remembered late, if at all. I wore Claire's outgrown coats and was told to be grateful for the warmth. When report cards came home, mine got a nod and Claire's got a celebration. And I learned to read the difference between the two like a second language. The lesson underneath was always the same. And my mother said it out loud once, the year I turned 13, when I asked why I couldn't come to the cousin's lake house. She crouched down so we'd be eye to eye, the way you do when you want a thing to land. You were a kindness, Lena, she said, not a daughter. She meant it gently. That was the worst part. She believed she was being honest, even kind, telling a girl exactly where the edges of her belonging were drawn. I didn't cry. I went to my room and I studied because somewhere in my small, bruised logic, I had decided that if I could only be good enough, useful enough, undeniable enough, they would have to keep me. I made myself into a person no family could afford to lose. It is a tiring way to live, but there was one person in that house who never once made me earn my chair. And on the worst birthday of my life, he was about to come through my door. My grandfather Walter called me sweetheart, and he never put a price on the word. He was the one fixed point in a childhood of moving walls. Every autumn when I was small, he'd set me on a stool in his kitchen and we would make a spiced apple tart together, his big hands over my little ones on the rolling pin, cinnamon and nutmeg and apples so ripe they'd bruise if you looked at them wrong. I still make that tart every single year. I have never once stopped to wonder why I know the recipe by heart when no one wrote it down. It simply lived in my hands the way some songs live in you, long after you forget who taught them. Grandpa was 82 that winter, or near enough. He'd had a fall in August, a bad one, off the back steps in the first frost. After that, he got quieter, foggier, more careful with his words, like a man crossing a frozen pond who can't quite remember where the thin spots are. My mother had stepped in to handle his affairs, as she put it. And I'd been glad, honestly, glad someone was looking after him. I didn't ask questions. I was busy being the family's reliable nothing. The daughter-shaped helper who showed up for tax season and funerals and never for Christmas. So, when I think back to that birthday, I think first of the tart cooling on my counter, untouched. A recipe I couldn't explain in a house no one would come to. I didn't know yet that the recipe wasn't Grandpa's to give. I didn't know whose hands it had really come from. That was sitting in his coat pocket folded into thirds waiting in the rain. The doorbell rang at 7, long after the candles had drowned. I almost didn't answer. I thought it might be Claire come to gloat or to apologize, and I had no appetite left for either. But through the glass I saw a hunched shape dripping wet, and I pulled the door open to find my grandfather standing on my step. No hat, rain streaming down his thin hair, breathing like the walk from the car had cost him something. "They told me you weren't doing dinner this year," he said. "Then I saw the cards on your mother's table, 12 of them, and only 11 chairs full at Claire's." He had counted. He had done the math an old foggy mind shouldn't have managed, and the answer had been me alone. I got him inside into the warm, into a chair. His hands were trembling, and not only from the cold. "Lena," he said, "they keep bringing me papers to sign. I sign them. I don't always know what they say anymore." Then he reached into his coat and took out a ledger, leather-bound and soft at the corners, the kind that has been carried a long time. He set it in my palm and closed my fingers over it with both of his hands. "I should have given this to you years ago," he said. "Caroline made me promise, and I'm an old coward who kept the promise to everyone but you." I had no idea who Caroline was. The name meant nothing to me, and somehow it meant everything. The way a word in a language you've forgotten can still raise the hair on your arms. If you have ever sat with an older person who signs papers they don't understand, you already feel the cold I felt then. My hands knew before I did. They opened that ledger the way you peel a bandage. Slow, braced for what's underneath. 3 things slid into my lap. A photograph soft as cloth from handling. A folded letter. The paper gone the color of weak tea, and a document with a state seal. Official, creased into quarters. I unfolded the document first because numbers and forms are where I live. And a form will tell you the truth, a face won't. It was a birth certificate. The original, the long kind, the one hospitals fill out before the world gets a chance to revise it. My birth date, my weight, 7 LP20Z on a winter morning 32 years gone. And there on the line marked Mother, a name typed in the flat letters of an old machine. Caroline Hartwell. Not adopted from a stranger. Not taken in out of charity from some unknown girl in trouble, Hartwell. The name was already mine before anyone decided to lend it to me. The line marked father was blank. The line marked mother was not. I looked up at my grandfather and he was watching me the way you watch someone walk across that frozen pond, hoping, praying that the ice will hold. "Grandpa," I said, and my voice came out very small, the voice of the girl on the stool with flour on her nose. "Who is Caroline?" He took a long breath, the kind that has 32 years inside it, and he told me. "Caroline was my daughter," he said, "my youngest, your mother." The words went into me slowly, the way cold water finds you, ankle, then knee, then heart. Caroline. William's little sister. The aunt no one had ever once mentioned in 30 years of Sunday dinners. Of photo albums I'd flipped through, looking for a face that looked like mine. She had been 24. There was black ice on Highway 99 the February I was almost 2, and a truck that couldn't stop. And after that there was just a baby and a grave and a family that decided the simplest thing was silence. "She was driving back to us," Grandpa said. "Coming home. You were asleep in the back, you didn't have a scratch on you." He reached out and took my hand, turned it over in his, traced the lines of my palm with a thumb gone soft and spotted with age. "You have her hands," he said. "I've watched you roll out that tart crust every fall for 30 years and seen Caroline standing right there. That's her recipe, sweetheart, not mine. I just kept teaching it so a piece of her would stay in this family even after they scrubbed her name off everything." I sat very still. All my life I had been told I was a kindness, a guest, a girl with no claim, lucky to be let in the door. And here was a yellowed page from the state of Oregon telling me I had been a Hartwell before I drew my first breath. Not taken in, brought home, the grief of it and the fury of it arrived together, twins holding hands. But it was what he said next that turned the grief into something colder, something with edges, something I could use. "Why?" I asked. "Why would anyone keep this from me?" Grandpa's jaw worked like the answer tasted bad. "After Caroline died, somebody had to take you," he said. "I was a widower already, too old. William was her brother, the natural choice. But Eleanor had just lost a baby of her own that winter, her third. The house was tight. Money was tighter. And here came a child that wasn't hers with a dead girl's face." He stopped, gathering it. "She agreed to raise you on one condition, that nobody ever told you whose you really were. She didn't want a ghost at her table. She wanted you to be grateful, not connected, and William, God help him, he wanted peace more than he wanted to do right by his own sister's child. So they made you a story instead of a daughter. The kindness, the charity case. Every cruel small thing fell into place at once. The late birthdays, the hand-me-down coats, the careful, constant reminding that I was lucky to be there. It was never thoughtlessness. It was maintenance. They had spent 30 years keeping a wall in good repair, because the truth on the other side of it would have made me one of them by blood, with all the claims that blood carries. A daughter could expect things. A kindness could only say thank you. I looked at the birth certificate in my lap at my mother's name on a line no one had wanted me to read, and I felt the last childish hope I'd been carrying finally set down its bags and leave. They were never going to choose me. They had decided that before I could walk. The only question left was what I was going to do about it. I unfolded the letter last because some doors you open only when you're ready to walk through them. The handwriting was young, looping, sure of itself in the way of a person who hasn't yet learned how much can be lost. "My dear Lena," it began, and I had to stop and breathe because no one in that family had ever started a sentence to me with the word dear. She wrote it before she died on a night she couldn't sleep the way new mothers don't. She wrote about my fists, how they grabbed her finger and wouldn't let go. She wrote that I had a stubborn chin and that she hoped I'd use it. She wrote that she was scared, a single mother at 23 with no ring, and a family that loved her and judged her in the same breath. And she wrote a sentence I would carry into every room I walked into for the rest of my life. "Whatever happens," she wrote, "please make sure she knows she was never a burden to me. She was the best thing I ever did." I heard my own voice in the cadence of her sentences. I heard the dry little jokes I make when I'm nervous. 32 years I had wondered why I never fit the Hartwell mold, why I was all sharp edges and quiet stubbornness in a family of soft, agreeable liars. Here was the answer in a dead woman's handwriting. I wasn't a poor copy of them. I was a faithful copy of her, and she had asked one thing of the people who took me. She had asked them to do right by me. I sat with that letter in my lap and thought very clearly for the first time. Has anyone ever done right by me at all? Grandpa shifted in his chair, and I watched the present crowd back in on him. The fog rolling over the clear patch he'd fought so hard to reach. "There's something else," he said. "Something I need your help with, and you're the only one I trust with numbers." Since the fall, he told me my mother had taken over everything. The mail came to her house now. The bank statements stopped coming to him at all. He signed what she put in front of him because his hand still knew how, even when his mind had gone soft, and because questioning Eleanor had always cost more than it was worth. "My accounts feel lighter, Lena," he said. "I can't explain it better than that. Like a coat with the lining torn out. And last week William asked me to sign a paper about the house. My house, the one Caroline grew up in. Something in me went very still and very awake at the same time. It is a particular feeling, the one I get when a client slides a shoebox of receipts across my desk, and I can already smell the fraud before I've opened the lid. I am good at exactly one thing in this world, and it is reading what money has been doing when no one was watching." I did not say any of this to Grandpa. I did not accuse anyone or promise revenge or raise my voice. He'd had enough loud people in his life. I just took his cold hands in my warm ones, my mother's hands, and I said, "Grandpa, will you let me look? Just look at the statements, the papers, all of it." Relief broke over his face like a thaw. "I was hoping you'd ask," he said, and just like that, my grief had a job to do. Here is what people like my mother never understand about people like me. They fight with volume, they fight with shame, with seating charts, with who gets invited and who eats alone. They win by making you feel small in front of everyone you wanted to love you. I don't fight that way. I never learned how, and by the time I was grown, I no longer wanted to. My whole childhood had been a master class in how useless a raised voice is against a family that's already decided who you are, so I put my faith somewhere quieter and harder to argue with. I put it in paper, in dates, in the slow, patient, unanswerable language of a ledger that does not care how charming you are or how good your gravy is. Eleanor had her weapons, the lies and the public humiliations, the careful work of making me a stranger at my own blood's table. I had mine, documents, process, the exact, boring, devastating truth of where 80 years of one man's money had gone and at whose hand. I don't raise my voice at numbers. I just read them out loud until everyone in the room has to hear what they say. That night, after I'd tucked a quilt around my grandfather on my own couch and watched him fall asleep mid-sentence, safe, warm, fed, I sat down at my kitchen table, the one nobody had come to, and I opened my laptop. 12 cold play settings still circled me like a jury. I cleared a space among them and I started the way I start every case that matters, with a single empty spreadsheet and a question I already half knew the answer to. Grandpa had signed a durable power of attorney in April, 6 weeks after the fall, naming Eleanor as his agent. On its own, that's nothing. Families do it every day and most of them mean well. But a power of attorney is a loaded thing in the wrong hands, a key to a house with no one home, and the law in Oregon expects the person holding it to act only for the old man's benefit, never their own. So I followed the money the way you follow footprints in fresh snow, one careful step at a time. What I found did not look like care. It looked like a harvest. Starting in May, money had begun leaving Grandpa's accounts in steady, deliberate amounts. $15,000 to Claire in June, tagged in the memo line as a loan. $11,000 to Daniel in July, another loan. Though I could find no note, no schedule, no sign anyone intended to pay a dime back. A new car, a roof, a home improvement on a house that wasn't Grandpa's. And worse, the account he'd set aside years ago and labeled in his own shaky hand for my care. The one meant to keep him in his own home with help as he aged, had been drained to almost nothing by autumn. Then I found the drafts, a new will, half finished, sitting in my mother's email as an attachment, cutting the small bequests Grandpa had made to old friends and to his church, folding everything to Claire and Daniel, and a purchase agreement, unsigned but dated, for the sale of his house, Caroline's house. They weren't just spending him down, they were dismantling him while he was still alive to watch. And they were doing it fast, like people who had heard a clock start ticking. They had. They just didn't know yet that the clock was me. I read Caroline's letter again that night. All the way through this time, slowly, the spreadsheet glowing beside it, like two halves of the same accusation. She had written more than I'd taken in at first. Near the end, in handwriting that had started to slant with tiredness, she wrote about money. "I've put aside a little for her," she wrote. "Not much. I clean houses and I save what I can. Daddy is holding it for me until she's grown so she'll never have to feel like anyone's charity, so she can stand on her own 2 feet. Tell her it came from me. Tell her I was working." There it was in a dead woman's hand, a fund, a small, honest, scraped-together fund started by a single mother on a housekeeper's wages, so that her daughter would never once have to feel the thing they'd spent my whole life making me feel. And folded inside her letter on a separate scrap was my grandfather's own note, dated years ago in the firm script of a younger man. "Carolyn's money for Lena, plus what I've added, kept in the family account to be given when she's ready." I understood then exactly what account they had drained to nothing. Not just an old man's savings, my mother's last gift to me. The one thing she'd left so I'd never feel like a kindness. They had spent it on a car for Claire and a roof for Daniel. The letter was the concrete thing I would hold in my mind for everything that came after. Heavier than any number on any screen. Eleanor had called me a kindness. The woman who actually bore me had spent her short life making sure I'd never have to be one, and the difference between those two women was the whole story. I folded the letter, smoothed it flat, and put it where I keep the documents I will not lose. Then I picked up the phone to find a lawyer. I want to be honest about what I did not do, because it matters. I did not hide a recorder under the birthday roast. I did not bait my mother into saying something ugly on the phone so I could play it back. That isn't strength. It's theater. And theater is what my family was good at, not me. Instead, I did the unglamorous thing. I made an appointment. Her name was Joan Peterson, an elder law attorney downtown with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, and a way of listening that made me feel for once like the sane person in the story. I laid it out for her the way I'd lay out a case file. The power of attorney, the transfers, the drained care account, my mother's fund inside it, the half-built will, the pending sale of the house. Joan didn't gasp. People in her line of work don't. She just made notes and asked the questions that mattered. Under Oregon's provisions on elder financial exploitation, she said, "What you're describing may rise well past poor judgment. Misusing a power of attorney for personal gain can be a breach of fiduciary duty, and depending on what the records show, it could support more than that." She was careful with her words, the way good lawyers are, full of may and could and pending, never promising me a verdict, only a path. We could petition the court for a formal accounting. We could ask to suspend the power of attorney while a judge looked. We could report a suspected case to Adult Protective Services. None of it was fast, none of it was certain. All of it was real and built of paper and impossible to charm or shout away. "It's a long road," Joan warned me. I told her I'd been walking longer ones since I was 2. They found out I was looking before I wanted them to. Of course they did. Banks called to confirm things, and a teller mentioned to my mother that her daughter, the investigator, had been asking how to request statement histories. Eleanor called me that evening, and her voice had lost all its birthday sugar. "I hear you've been poking around your grandfather's accounts," she said. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stay out of family business." I held the phone away from my ear for a moment and breathed. "He asked me to look," I said. "Since when do you take his calls?" "You couldn't be bothered to set him a place at dinner." She laughed short and sharp. "He's confused, Lena. He doesn't know what he's asking for, and neither do you." Then she said the thing she always reached for when she wanted to put me back in my box. "This is between his children. You were never really one of us, and you know it." Once that sentence would have ended me. I would have apologized, retreated, gone back to earning my chair with casseroles and silence. Not anymore. I had a birth certificate in a drawer that said otherwise, and a letter from a woman who'd loved me before any of them ever decided not to. "You're right," I said, calm as a closing entry. "I was never one of you. I'm something you should have been a lot more careful about." And I hung up first, which I had never once done in my life. If you've ever been told you weren't really family by the very people who needed you to believe it, I see you. For the next 2 weeks, I did what I am built to do. I built a record with Grandpa's clear written consent given on one of his good mornings with Joan present as a witness. We requested the full histories on every account. We moved to revoke the power of attorney properly through the right channels so that no one could later say I had snatched it in the dark. I built a timeline in a spreadsheet that grew until it had its own gravity. Date, amount, account, recipient, memo, my note. Every transfer that left Grandpa's account since April sat in a row, lined up, undeniable, a parade of small thefts dressed as loans. My whole life, people had treated my over-responsibility like a flaw. Too careful, too much. Can't you ever just let something go, Lena? But the thing they'd mocked in me turned out to be the exact tool the moment required. I am the woman who keeps every receipt. I am the woman who reads the fine print at the bottom of the page that everyone else signs blind. Eleanor had counted on the family's habit of looking away. She had not counted on the one member they'd shoved to the edge being a professional at looking closely. Numbers don't gossip. They don't take sides at birthdays. They just remember with a patience that outlasts any lie exactly what was done. And when, by the end of those 2 weeks, I had a binder tabbed, dated, cross-referenced, the kind of thing I usually hand to a grieving widow so she can sleep again. Except this time, the estate being plundered belonged to a living man who was still being asked to sign his own dismantling. And the next paper they wanted from him was the one that would sell Caroline's house. I almost felt sorry for my mother. I want to put that on the record because it would be easy to make her a cartoon, and she wasn't one. Buried in the old family papers I'd pulled, I found the dates. The winter I came to them, Eleanor had lost her 3rd pregnancy in October, late the kind that has a name and a tiny gown. And in February, with the grief still raw, Her husband's dead sister's baby had landed in her arms in a house where the heat got shut off twice that year. I found a note in her hand from back then to William that said only, "I can't grieve mine while I'm feeding hers." For a moment, sitting on my floor, surrounded by the wreckage of two families, I understood her. I was a wound she'd been handed before her own had closed. There were even records of her sitting up with me through a fever, that first spring, a receipt from an all-night pharmacy, her name on the line. She had not been a monster at the start. She had been a drowning woman handed an anchor and told to call it a gift. And then I turned the page, and the sympathy died the way it always died with Eleanor on contact with what she actually chose. Because understanding why a person started cold does not excuse what she did warm. She knew by autumn exactly what that drained account had been for. She had Caroline's letter in the same box of papers I'd just been crying over. She'd read it, and she had spent my dead mother's housekeeping savings on a luxury SUV for the daughter she did keep. You can be a victim and a thief in the same lifetime. My mother was living proof. I closed the file. The almost sympathy folded itself up small, and I put it away, and I did not take it out again. I gave William a chance. He was my uncle after all, the only blood relative of mine left standing who'd actually known Caroline, who'd grown up with her, who'd carried me out of a wrecked car on a highway when I was not quite 2. I drove out to his place on a gray Tuesday and sat across from him at his kitchen table. And I did not bring the binder. I brought the letter. I set it in front of him and watched his face do the slow collapse of a man recognizing his sister's handwriting. "I know whose I am now," I told him quietly. "I'm not here to blow up your life. I'm here to ask you to help me protect your father, that's all. Stand with me, William, and most of this never has to leave the family." For one moment I thought he might. His hand went to the letter, his eyes went wet, and the boy who'd loved his little sister flickered behind the tired face of the man who'd helped erase her. Then he slid the letter back across the table to me, untouched, like something hot. "Dad's fine," he said. "Eleanor's taking good care of him. You always did make a drama out of things, Lena. Let it go. Let it go." The family motto, the 2 words they'd used to bury Caroline and to keep me grateful and to look away from everything inconvenient for 30 years. I picked up my mother's letter and stood. "Okay," I said, "I'll let you go." He didn't catch the difference, but I meant every word of it. I had just stopped asking permission from the people who would never give it. From here on, I would only be asking the court. Word travels fast in a family that's circling the wagons. Within a day of leaving Williams, I learned that Claire had heard I'd been snooping, and Claire, unlike our mother, did not believe in patience. She believed in speed. She always had, ever since we were kids, and she'd grab the bigger slice before anyone could measure. Now she moved to push the house sale through before anything could stop it, leaning on a realtor friend, pressing Granthaha for a signature on one of his foggy afternoons. She started clearing out the smaller accounts too, the ones still within reach of the power of attorney that on paper my mother still held. That was the cruelty of it, the part that kept me up at night. The law moves at the speed of the law. A petition takes days to draft, longer to be heard, but a woman with a valid power of attorney and a checkbook can empty an account in an afternoon. The very thing that made my approach honest, doing it through proper channels, also made it slow, and they were sprinting through the gap. I called Joan in something close to panic. She talked me down with the flat calm of a person who has seen families do worse. "We file for emergency relief," she said. "We ask the court to freeze the house sale and suspend the power of attorney now on the documentation you've built while the full accounting proceeds." So that's what we did. I didn't drive over to Claire's and scream. I didn't post the receipts online for the satisfaction of watching them squirm. I sat with my lawyer until midnight assembling an emergency petition. Every claim nailed to a document, every dollar traced to a date. They were fast. But the thing about fast people is that they leave a trail, and I was very, very good at reading trails. We filed on a Thursday. I remember because I wore my mother's hands all day. Steady on the pen, steady on the wheel, steady. When the clerk stamped the date and made it real, we did 3 things at once. The way you set 3 locks on a door you finally understand is unsafe. We reported a suspected case of elder financial exploitation to Adult Protective Services, with the binder attached, every transfer laid out in rows. We petitioned the court for a full formal accounting of everything done under that power of attorney since April, and we asked on an emergency basis to suspend Eleanor's authority and to halt the sale of the house until a judge could look at what I'd found. None of it was loud. There were no cameras, no confrontation, no scene for anyone to clip and share. Just papers sliding across a counter into a system built precisely for the moment a family fails the person it's supposed to protect. Joan warned me again that nothing was guaranteed, that the wheels would turn slowly, that the other side would have their say. I told her I understood, and then 2 days later, the first wheel turned. The court issued a temporary order. The power of attorney was suspended pending review. The house sale was frozen. For the first time since the fall, my grandfather's money sat still, untouchable by the people who'd been bleeding it, because a judge in Multnomah County had read what I'd written and decided it was worth a closer look. I sat in my car outside the courthouse, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt something quieter and far older. I felt like a daughter who had finally, 30 years late, gotten to do something for her family that her family had never once done for her. There was just one thing left undone. They didn't know yet, and Grandpa's 80th birthday was 9 days away. My mother, never one to waste a stage, had planned my grandfather's 80th birthday like a coronation. A big party at his house, the Good House, Caroline's house, with the relatives and the neighbors, and a few old friends from the church he'd been quietly cut out of. It was a performance, and I knew exactly what it was for. After the freeze order landed, after the lawyers and the agency started circling, Eleanor needed to be seen as the devoted caregiver, the loving daughter-in-law throwing a beautiful party for the old man she adored. Optics, the same instinct that built a birthday without me, was now building a birthday around appearances. I was not invited. Naturally, the mirror of that empty table was almost funny if you have my sense of humor, which is dry and a little bruised. They would gather again and I would be left off the list again, and they assumed again that I would do what I had always done. Stay home, eat alone, be grateful for the leftovers of their attention. But I wasn't that girl anymore. The tart had cooled and so had I. I was going to that party. I was going to walk into Caroline's house through the front door the way her daughter had every right to. And I was going to bring 2 things with me, a binder and a lawyer. Eleanor had told me we only set 1 good tables this year. Fine. I decided I would set the record straight at hers in front of everyone, with the calm of a woman reading a balance sheet aloud. 9 days I spent them getting ready, not rehearsing speeches, tabbing pages. The truth doesn't need a speech, it just needs to be read in order. The night before the party, I sat at my kitchen table and assembled the binder one last time, and I watched my own hands do the work, steady. Sure, Caroline's hands, Grandpa had said, and I believed him now. They had held a rolling pin and a fevered baby and a housekeeper's mop. And now they squared a stack of bank statements and slid them into tabbed sleeves, and there was no tremor in them at all. Tab 1, the power of attorney. Tab 2, the transfers in order with the memo lines that said, loan over money no one would ever repay. Tab 3, the drained care account, and beside it, a copy of Caroline's letter, so that anyone who read the binder would understand exactly whose savings had bought that SUV. Tab 4, the half-built will. Tab 5, the frozen house sale, and the court's order beside it like a closed door. When it was done, I did one more thing, the thing that surprised me most about myself. I baked the spiced apple tart, cinnamon and nutmeg and apples just past ripe, the recipe living in my hands the way it always had. Except now I knew the truth of it. It wasn't a comfort I'd borrowed. It was an inheritance no one could drain, passed mother to daughter through an old man's stubborn love. I wasn't bringing it to make peace. I had no peace left to offer them. I was bringing it because I wanted something of Caroline's at that table, something warm to sit beside all the cold paper, her recipe and her records, her sweetness and her receipts. Walking through the front door together in her daughter's steady hands, I slept 4 hours and woke up calm. The morning of the party, the rain had stopped. Caroline's house glowed when I pulled up, every window lit, cars lining the street, a paper banner over the porch that said 80 years young in my mother's careful hand. I sat for a moment with the binder on the passenger seat and the tart warm in its carrier and let myself feel the size of what I was about to do. Then I went up the walk and let myself in the front door because a daughter doesn't knock at her own family's house. The party stopped the way a needle scratches off a record. William saw me first and went pale. Daniel froze with a beer halfway to his mouth. Claire's smile curdled, and there across the room were the witnesses I hadn't dared hope for. Old Ruth from next door, who'd known Caroline as a girl, 2 of Grandpa's friends from the church, the very ones the new will had quietly cut out, and by the bookshelf, in a sensible coat holding a slim leather folder and a cup of coffee like she'd been invited. Joan Peterson, my lawyer, who had agreed that a public reckoning, witnessed and documented, was worth her Saturday. My mother came at me fast across the room. Hostess smile stretched thin over fury. "What are you doing here?" she hissed low so the guests wouldn't hear. "This is family only, you need to leave." I held my ground and my tart, I did not raise my voice. I had promised myself I wouldn't, not once, no matter what they said. And before I could answer her, before I had to, a voice cut across the whole bright, crowded room, thin and cracked and absolutely certain, the voice of a man who had counted 12 name cards and 11 full chairs and never forgiven the difference. "Lena stays." My grandfather had pushed himself up from his chair at the head of the room, one hand white-knuckled on the armrest, the other pointing at the seat beside him. The fog was gone from his eyes. Some mornings he came all the way back and God had given him this one. "She stays," he said again into the silence. "And the rest of you are going to sit down and listen to what she found." Eleanor laughed, that bright, brittle laugh she used to paper over cracks. "Dad, you're tired, you're confused. This is your party." "I am 80 years old," he said, and clearer than he'd been in months. "And I am asking my granddaughter to tell the truth in my own house for once." Granddaughter. The word landed in the room like a dropped plate. I saw Ruth's hand go to her mouth. I saw William close his eyes. I walked to the table, the long dining table set with my mother's good china, the family table I had never once been seated at as an equal, and I set the binder down on it. Not slammed, set. The way you set down something heavy you've carried a long way. Then I set the tart beside it, and the warm smell of cinnamon and nutmeg drifted up into a room that had gone dead quiet. "Most of you don't know who I am," I said. And my voice came out level, almost gentle. "So, let me start there, because it matters to everything else. I have spent my career talking to rooms full of frightened, grieving people about money, and I have learned that the calmer you are, the more they have to hear you. So I was calm. I was the calmest person in that house. My mother's name was Caroline Hartwell," I said. "I'm not the kindness this family took in. I'm the daughter you hid. And in the last 3 weeks, with my grandfather's permission, I've been reading the records of what's been done to him since his fall." I opened the binder to the first tab. Let's start in April. I read it the way I read any case, plainly in order by the date. On April 11th, 6 weeks after the fall, Grandpa signed a durable power of attorney naming Eleanor his agent. The law says she could only use it for his benefit. I turned the page in June, $15,000 went to Claire. Memo line, loan. There is no loan agreement. In July, $11,000 to Daniel, also a loan. Also no agreement, no payment, no schedule. Claire's face went from white to red. "You don't know what you're." "I do actually," I said. Not louder, just steadier, and I turned another page. "This is the account Grandpa set aside for his own care so he could stay in this house with help as he got older. In May it held $140,000. By November, it held $900. I let that sit. 900 from $140,000. I have learned that the right number, said quietly, hits harder than any accusation. "It paid for a car," I said, "a roof, a kitchen that isn't in this house." Now Eleanor was moving toward me, and her hostess mask was gone, the fury underneath finally showing its true face in front of every guest she'd wanted to impress. "How dare you," she said, and her voice cracked and climbed. "How dare you come into this house and after everything we gave you? You ungrateful little." She was shouting now in front of Ruth, in front of the church friends, in front of the whole performance she'd built. And I was not. That was the whole inversion, the thing I'd promised myself in the car. She got louder and I stayed level, and with every decibel she rose, the room turned a little more toward me, and a little more away from her, because a screaming woman and a calm one, telling her about her own bank statements, do not look like equals. They look like the guilty and the proven. "There's more," I said when she ran out of breath. "But first you keep using a word for me, I'd like to give it back." "Say what you came to say," Eleanor spat, "and get out of my house." "It isn't your house," I said. "It's his. It was Caroline's. And you've been trying to sell it out from under him." Her chin came up and she reached the way she always reached for the one weapon that had worked on me for 30 years. "You will always be exactly what you've always been," she said. "You were a kindness, Lena, not a daughter." The room held its breath. Once those words had been the floor falling out from under me. Now I just reached into the binder, slid out a single page, and laid it face up on the family china. The original birth certificate, the state seal, the typed flat letters. "I was Caroline's daughter," I said. "Her name is right there on the line. And in the only fact that matters tonight, I am the single person in this room who actually protected your father. I turned to face the guests, not the family, because the truth deserves witnesses, and witnesses were exactly what Eleanor had so kindly assembled. She told me my whole life I wasn't really one of you, I said. She needed me to believe it because a kindness can't inherit, can't object, can't ask where the money went, but a granddaughter can. Grandpa's voice came again from his chair, rough with tears. She's mine, he said simply. Caroline's girl. I held her the day she was born, and I held her the day they took Caroline away. And I have been ashamed for 30 years that I let them make her a stranger in her own family. Ruth was crying openly now. William had his face in his hands, and Claire, my sister, who had set one good table without me, looked at the birth certificate on the china and then at me, and I watched the exact moment she understood that the girl she'd spent her life outranking had outranked her all along, by blood, by law, and by the simple fact of being the only honest person left standing. That was the moment my mother reached for the binder to grab it, to scatter the pages, to turn it back into noise she could control. And that was the moment Joan Peterson stepped out from beside the bookshelf and set her coffee down. I wouldn't, Joan said in the mild voice of a person who has done this many times. I'm Miss Hartwell's attorney. Everything in that binder is already filed. The room turned to her. 2 days ago, Joan went on, the Multnomah County Court issued a temporary order. Eleanor, your power of attorney is suspended, pending a full accounting of every transaction since April. The sale of this house is frozen, and a report has been opened with Adult Protective Services regarding the use of these funds. She let it land, then added gently, you'll all have a chance to respond, that's how it works. But as of Thursday, no one in this family can move another dollar of Walter's money without a judge watching. There it was. Not a trick, not a recording sprung at the perfect moment, not some secret deed falling from the sky to save the day, just the slow, unglamorous machinery of the law, set in motion by a woman with a spreadsheet and a grievance old enough to vote. The power my mother had spent a year quietly hoarding had been turned off at the wall, and she had found out at the party she'd thrown to look devoted. Daniel sat down hard. Claire was already on her phone calling someone, anyone, and Eleanor stood in the center of her beautiful ruined party, mouth working, finding for once that there was no volume loud enough to shout down a court order. I closed the binder. I had not raised my voice once. The tart steamed gently on the table, and my grandfather, in the sudden quiet, reached out his hand to me across all of it. I took his hand. His thumb found the lines of my palm. Caroline's lines, the way it had on the night of my birthday, and he held on. I don't want it handled by family anymore, he said loud enough for the room. Any of you. I want a stranger doing my books. Somebody with no horse in this race, watching every dollar so I can die in my own house, knowing the truth's on the record. He looked at me, including, you, sweetheart. Especially you. I won't have them saying you did this for the money. I don't want the money. Grandpa, I said, and I meant it down to the floor. I turned and said it to the whole room so no one could ever rewrite it later. I'm not here for an inheritance. I don't want the house or the accounts or a single dollar of what's left. You can write me out of every will in Oregon. I came because somebody had to stand between this man and the people robbing him, and it turned out the only one who would was the kindness you threw away. I asked the court the following week to appoint a neutral fiduciary, a professional with no stake and no name in this family, to oversee Grandpa's care and finances. I asked for nothing for myself, and the record shows it. For 30 years, they had told me I had no claim on this family. So I made the only claim I ever actually wanted. Not to their money, not to their name, just the right to protect the one person who'd loved me without an invoice, and to do it in the light, where they could all watch and none of them could stop me. Eleanor had wanted a story instead of a daughter. She got one. It just wasn't the one she wrote. Here is how it actually ended, because real life pays its debts slower than the movies. The court appointed the fiduciary, a quiet woman named Patricia, who runs my grandfather's accounts now with the warmth of a parking meter, which is exactly what the situation needed. The formal accounting confirmed most of what my binder had already shown. Some of the money came back. The loans called in, the SUV sold, Adult Protective Services made its findings. There were no handcuffs, no dramatic perp walk, just the slow civil grinding of repayment plans and a permanent note in a file somewhere that the Hartwells had taken from their own. Eleanor never apologized. She is not built for it. William sent a single text months later that just said, I'm sorry about Caroline, which was the closest that family ever got to the truth and still not close enough. Claire and Daniel I haven't spoken to since, and I've stopped waiting for the call where they understand. I didn't slam the door on any of them. I just stopped holding it open, stopped setting the extra places, stopped rounding hope up. Grandpa stayed in Caroline's house with help that's actually paid for now, with Patricia watching the books and me watching the rest. He's slower these days, foggier, but on his good mornings, he still asks me to make the tart, and I still set him on the stool of my kitchen with his hands over mine. The way it started, the way it should have stayed. The cruelest thing they ever did was teach me I had to earn a family. The best thing I ever did was stop believing them. This birthday I set the table again, 12 places. The pressed linen, the hand-lettered cards, my grandmother's good china. The difference was who came. Grandpa at the head where he belongs. Ruth from next door who tells me stories about Caroline as a girl until I almost feel I knew her. Joan who turned out to be lonely on holidays and very good with a corkscrew. A friend from work I'd kept at arm's length for years because letting people close had always felt like a debt I'd have to repay. A neighbor and her kids, people I chose and who chose me back with no blood and no obligation and no invoice at the end of the night. The spiced apple tart sat in the center of the table where it had always belonged, and when I cut it, I told them all whose recipe it really was. My mother once told me we only set one good table this year, and she said it like a sentence, like a door closing. She was right about one thing in the end. You really only need one good table. I just had to stop begging for a chair at hers and build my own. The candles burned down that night too, the same as the year before. But this time the light didn't feel like loss. It felt like every face it touched, 12 chairs, 12 people, not one of them obligated to be there, all of them choosing it anyway. Family was never the people who shared my blood or signed the papers that bound me to them. It turned out to be the one old man who pulled a chair up to my cold table when no one else would, and the handful of people I finally learned to set a place for on purpose, because belonging you have to earn was never belonging at all. That's my story. An empty table, an old ledger, and a grandfather who finally told the truth before it was too late. If it made you want to check on an older person's paperwork or look a little closer at who's holding their accounts, take that as your sign and do it this week. And if you know someone caring for an aging parent, share this with them. Thank you for being here. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.